So today we are privileged to hear from Dr. Steve Leavitt. Steve works at BYU, and he is a professor in the biology department, and the curator of lichens, as he said, at BYU's Life Science Museum, which if you're like me and went to BYU, but it's been a while, that is what was formerly called the Bean Museum. So he loves poking around in the mountains and deserts, looking for awe and wonder with friends, families, and students. And he is an evolutionary biologist by training, and his research focuses on processes influencing biodiversity in arid regions, and how evolution occurs in symbiotic systems. So he is going to be talking about his research with air pollution and I believe monitoring what we can see about air pollution in lichens. Steve is also my husband's cousin's husband, if that made sense, if I said that correctly. So I can attest he is a wonderful speaker and has a lot of interesting things to talk about. So you're in for a good one. And I think that's all I have to say to introduce you. So Steve, you want to take it away?
Thanks, Chloe. I'm super glad to be here. I think this community is fantastic, and it's so great that you can get together and share ideas, share perspectives. I'm really honored to kind of be here and kind of share a little bit of my work. What I do is kind of weird and strange, but I have to say, like, as a disclaimer, I started off, and as an undergraduate, I was a terrible student. I hated school. I didn't do super well in school. And then somewhere along the way, I saw these lichens and school became something completely different. And it's changed totally what I do. Okay, so, as an undergrad, I got to go out and start climbing around in the mountains. I found an advisor who's willing to deal with my stupidity and was really patient as I was learning things. And I came into this with a whole lot of questions, expecting to get really clear, straightforward answers and learn along the way, and at some point become an expert. And it didn't take very long before I realized that, like, getting answers along the way was going to be the exception. And most of the time I would just be getting more and more and more questions. So my talk today is kind of leading towards how do we deal with all of those questions as we aim to become good stewards of the earth and understand and worship this awesome creation that's all around us. And I want to start with a little story. Southeast of Pittsburgh, there's a little town called Dorona. It's a mill town in the middle of Pennsylvania. And in 1938, well, this town was consistently hazy due to the milling activity in the city. And in 1938, there was an exceptional inversion that came in and trapped all this bad air. And the mills kept running, they kept pumping out bad air. And over the course of 3 or 4 days, people started to get really sick. And the chief of the fire department, John Volk, he saw these people starting to get sick, and he started taking the oxygen that they had on hand, and they had something like, I don't remember what it was, 800 cubic feet, as I recall. And he's taking this oxygen and he's administering it to the citizens of the community, trying to save them from this terrible air that's engulfed the city. And this wasn't their first encounter with crappy air. This happened consistently, but this was a time when it got trapped and it wasn't flushed out by a subsequent storm. And over the course of these 3 days or so, 26 people died. Nearly half of the city of 14,000 people became sick. And even decades down the road, the city still had a higher than average mortality rate, likely tied to this really specific pollution event. And the fire chief went and he, administered all of the oxygen that they had, saving citizens in the community. He went to neighboring municipalities, got their oxygen, and ended up saving, untold numbers of lives. And when asked if he used the oxygen for himself, he said, no, I just went home and I would drink some whiskey and go back out to save people. So here's some images of kind of what that rescue attempt looked like by John Volk and some of the caring citizens of Dorona, Pennsylvania. And here's kind of one of the culprits. right? This is the wire mill of Dorona. They also had a zinc mill, and it's probably the emissions from the zinc mill that had the highest impact on human health. This is an image from the Library of Congress. And this really specific pollution event was probably one of the worst in the nation in our history. If we were together, I'd ask you guys if you know of other big pollution events, and likely you could tell me some other ones. And there are other pollution events. For example, in St. Louis, they had been plagued by bad air quality starting in the late 1800s. And this was largely due to burning soft coal, and smoke pollution had been an issue for decades there. And eventually in 1939, again, due to abnormally cold weather and a high pressure that's keeping those emissions in, they had a terrible air quality event on a single day. And again, it was from burning soft coal. They called this Black Tuesday. And the place got super nasty, and multiple people died. And then 9 more days throughout that next month, there were other really terrible air pollution events. The Great Smog of London in the 1950s, this was another terrible air pollution event. This resulted also from burning soft coal. And this air pollution event became so nasty that streetlights were turning on at night. People couldn't breathe. They're walking out with flashlights. They're hunkering down, closing their doors, and the smog is still seeping into their houses. And ultimately, it's estimated that between 8,000 to 12,000 people died. And this was in 1952. That's not so long ago. Some of us may have been alive in the 50s. Some of our parents may have been alive in the 50s. And again, this is happening in London, where thousands of people die as a result of some air pollution events. Similarly, in the 1950s and 60s in New York City, it was consistently plagued by these big smog events. In 1953 and 1963, and again in 1966, there were really hardcore events that ended up killing hundreds of people in each one of those events. And this was largely due to carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and smoke. And again, this weird combination of weather and emissions, and people's lives were lost. But I think the most striking thing about these big air pollution events is that something really good came from tragedy. The Great Smog of London in the 50s ultimately was the impetus to pass, for the British Parliament to pass the Clean Air Act of 1956. And with that Clean Air Act, there came a fundamental shift in air quality, and we haven't had these same air events since then. And same thing in the 50s and 60s in New York City. These pollution events became the impetus for really important change. And that includes, like in 1967, our Air Quality Act that ultimately was changed and modified to become the Clean Air Act in 1970s. And these fundamentally changed the way that citizens in the UK and the United States deal with air pollution. But it's not only big cities that are plagued by air pollution. This is the Anaconda Copper Smelter in Western Montana. I hope some of you have been out there to see this. This is the tallest masonry stack. It's something like 585 feet high in the United States. And this was a copper smelter where they're bringing in ore and smelting that ore in the Anaconda Valley. And just downwind of that, they named a little city Opportunity. And they were trying to show that people could live even in the presence of this air pollution. Well, over the course of almost a century of copper smelting, in 1980, they assessed soil quality, water quality, air quality, and they said, this place is in bad shape, and it was designated a Superfund site, requiring tens or hundreds of $millions to try to reclaim this damaged area. And the residents of Opportunity shown in this picture, now they're living on top of soils that are contaminated with arsenic and other pollution events. And some of these type of changes, in this case, or in these type of pollution events, it did bring about some change, but it came at a much longer and prolonged cost. And these residents are still paying the cost of nearly a century of copper smelting. So we're fixing things, right? The idea is like we're making progress, whether it's a Superfund site, passing Clean Air Acts, etc. I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I'm at. I live on the Wasatch Front. And here's a picture of the Wasatch Front up from Lone Peak, looking across the valley. And we can see these inversion events where a high pressure traps in the emissions. And every winter, we're dealing with some of the worst air quality in the entire nation. So one of my friends and colleagues, Ben Abbott, had a student named Isabella Irigo. And here's a picture of Isabella. And they got together and said, let's quantify the impact of air pollution in Utah to see if we can get an idea of what happens. And let me show you kind of what happens here on the Wasatch Front where I live. And this is contemporary. This is what's happening like in my life as I live here on the Wasatch Front. It's estimated that air pollution shortens the life of the average Utahn by 2 years, right? So living here in the Wasatch Front where I'm breathing in all this inversion stuff, on average, it'll take off 2 years of my life. And it affects everyone. For example, 75% of Utahns will lose at least 1 year of their life because of air pollution. And nearly a quarter of all Utahns can lose even much more than that, up to like 5 years of their life simply because of air pollution. And that's a big deal. Living here, choosing to live here on the Wasatch Front, it cost me 2 years of my life. Other things that happen, let's see if we can do this. It has a big economic cost, and it's estimated to be about $1.8 billion annually. And this is both indirect and direct costs. Some of the direct costs are things like healthcare expensive, loss of learning potential, that type of thing. Well, indirect costs, they can be the loss of tourism, decreased growth, regulatory burden, business costs. So this pollution, it's still contemporarily having a big impact in our life. Fossil fuel pollution, it causes or worsens many of the illnesses and conditions that individuals already have. And there's a big deal. And at the same time, state level actions can totally help reduce this air pollution burden and benefit the economy. So when we think about the mandate that we find in the book of Matthew, where Jesus says, inasmuch as you've done this unto the least of these, my brethren, you did it unto me, right? As we're polluting or as we're reducing the impact of pollution, we're able to help solve a lot of these big issues and help other people. So if you want to read more about this, this was published a few years ago in the journal Atmosphere. Check it out, get blown away by how much life we lose simply by living in polluted areas, even in the 2020s. So these are interesting big picture problems that we have to deal with, but my questions are related to things a little further from cities. So for example, here we're looking at this is an alpine ridgeline in the Uinta Mountains. This is 100+ miles from any urban center. You're in the middle of nowhere. You have to hike in for 15 miles or ride a horse in. My questions are, well, what happens with the air pollution in some of these wilderness areas? And when we think about the wilderness system, this was a system that was proposed in the 1960s. And this is now it's called the National Wilderness System, and where the federal government recognized that these wilderness areas are sacred and should be set apart and held in perpetuity and protected. And this is a direct quote from the Wilderness Act of 1964, where it says, a wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. And this is a phenomenal forward-thinking piece of legislation that recognized the sanctity or the ability to set aside these incredible places, these wilderness areas, as a place where people can come as visitors, but there's value in itself to some of these habitats. So now when we look at the modern wilderness system, here's a map. All right, we can look across this. Most of the wilderness areas are in the Western United States, and it could be land managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Other wilderness areas are part of the National Forest System. Others are part of the national park system. Others are part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. But you can see that we now have hundreds of federally protected wilderness areas all across the Intermountain West, with a few moving into the Midwest and Eastern United States. So this is a really cool thing. And my question is, well, what the heck is happening in terms of air pollution in these wilderness areas? So I'm going to introduce the air quality biomonitoring program in a couple of minutes, but I want to start by introducing the system that I work with. This is a fascinating system, and these are called lichens. Lichens are this incredible thing that teaches us this, or has taught me this really fascinating perspective of being on Earth, this idea of interbeing. Interbeing, this is the idea that was largely proposed by a Vietnamese Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, and he talked about this idea of interbeing or interness, interconnectedness, and it's this dependent co-arising where you have to have multiple things together and they co-arise or give rise to some kind of novelty. So what I study is this novelty that arises from interbeing. So if you look at this slide, on the left-hand side, you see these 4 brown blobs, right? Those brown blobs are simply fungal hyphae that's grown on 4 different growth media. So you can take the same fungal strain, put it on 4 different types of growth media, and it grows kind of in 4 different ways, and it looks kind of different. That fungus on its own is not what I study, right? I study what are called lichens. And the lichen arises when you take a specific kind of fungus and it starts to interact with some kind of photosynthetic partner, some organism that does photosynthesis. And it could be a cyanobacterium, it could be a green alga. And now you have those fungal hyphae that are interacting with that photosynthetic partner. And that's what you see in that middle panel, those brown or tan fungal hyphae surrounding that green alga. And once you get that interaction, now we have emergence of something completely new that never existed without that interaction. And that figure on the right, that is the actual lichen. That's the emergence of this interaction. And I love this word. Again, it's pratit yasamupada. So this is the idea of if a thing exists, then that exists. If this ceases to exist, then that also ceases to exist. And lichens are the perfect system to start studying and understanding this idea of interbeing. Let me show you another picture that'll help highlight it. Get excited because these are baby lichens. On the left-hand side, you see these 2 different baby lichens. You have these little gray filaments expanding out from the center. These little gray strands that are expanding outward, those are the fungal hyphae. And those fungal hyphae are growing outward. And in the center, that center part is what is the actual lichen itself, where it has started to form this process of something new and novel. The top little baby lichen in the top left, that is a crater lichen. And the one on the bottom left is a scale lichen. And you can see the fungal hyphae look different, but once it forms the lichen, once there's that interbeing, we get this brand new novelty, something new that only arises from this interness or interbeing. And ultimately, these interactions give rise to a huge range of really fascinating morphologies and growth forms, and all kinds of beauty and interest that arises only through that interness. And tied to this is that idea of to be is to interbe. You cannot be a lichen unless you are interacting with other things. So you can look at this slide and see the huge range of diversity depending on the fungal partners and their algal partners. They'll form different morphologies. But interness or interbeing, it isn't limited only to lichens. We can think about this in terms of pollinator interactions with their host plants, right? These are dependencies with structures and traits and phenomena that only arise because of those interactions among unrelated organisms. We can also think about that in terms of some of these brood parasites. In the bottom left, we see this cuckoo bird and the reed warbler. As you're looking at that, you can see the bird that's feeding the other bird. The one that's feeding the other bird, the small yellow bird, that's a reed warbler, and it's feeding this brood parasite, a cuckoo bird, where the mother cuckoo bird laid its egg in the nest of the reed warbler, and now the reed warbler is rearing the cuckoo offspring as if it was its own offspring, right? And again, specific traits, behaviors, and adaptations come by this act of interbeing. On the bottom right, we see these kleptoplastic sea slugs, where these are sea slugs that have incorporated algae into their body, and rather than digesting the algae, they distribute those all across and they maintain them alive, and the algae do photosynthesis, making high energy carbon that the sea slug starts to use. So again, we have this idea of interactions give rise to novelty, and it's this process of interness. The last one could be even as simple as in this top right, the image of a Titan triggerfish, the bigger fish that creates new opportunities for the smaller fish by picking up and moving rocks that the smaller fish may not be able to move. And that disruption of the ocean floor creates novel feeding opportunities that would never exist. So this is all kind of divergent from lichen biomonitoring, right? But it's that idea that when you have a system of interacting organisms, any disruption to one of those members of that interaction ceases that whole process to continue onward. And this is one of the reasons why lichens make such an awesome biomonitor, or such a system for monitoring disturbance, is because if you interrupt any one of the players within a lichen, the whole lichen ceases to exist. And then we can start to get some really cool insight. And here's a little insight that we got. This was from a study that we published last year. This is the little blurb that the Smithsonian Magazine highlighted from our research. It's this idea that lichens are in an evolutionary arms race against climate change. We modeled and we tried to infer the rate of evolution for the photosynthetic partner in the algae, and we found that its rate of evolution is actually really, really slow. And it's slower than most of the other organismal groups that have been studied so far. And because of the evolution to fit new niches is so slow, that it's likely that these green algae won't be able to keep up with the predicted or the forecast changing climate. And if you lose your photosynthetic partner, the entire lichen symbiosis falls apart. So when we start thinking about these systems, the systems of interbeing become the canaries in a coal mine, the canaries that document any kind of change that can happen. And it's not only lichens that do this. You can look for deformities in amphibians, or the presence of or absence of amphibians. And those can be canaries in coal mines, or indicators of ecological change or some kind of disturbance to the ecosystem. You could look at aquatic invertebrates, and those are also really cool and really good examples of biomonitors. You could look at things like pines and the impact that ozone or other pollutants could have on pine trees. And those are also good biomonitors. Even things such as, if you're from the Intermountain West, you're familiar with sagebrush or sage steppe habitats. These sage habitats are actually one of the most common habitats in the Western United States, and they are in peril. We're losing over 1.5 million acres of sagebrush habitat every year. So any of these systems can be used as a canary in the coal mine, or a bioindicator for change. So finally, however far in we are, 20 minutes in, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do. Maybe. So here we have in the Intermountain West, with your money, your tax money, we've gone to over 500 sites to set up permanent biomonitoring reference plots, right? And each one of these bubbles in this Google map represents one of the sites that we've set up across the Intermountain West. And this has largely been done in conjunction with the National Forest Service. with some sites also in national parks and some on BLM land as well, or Bureau of Land Management land. And at each one of these 500 bubbles, we go out and we do an inventory, a full inventory of all of the lichens that occur at that site. And it is a fantastic job hiking into wilderness areas, deserts, mountains, woodlands, and looking at this huge range of lichen diversity. So first we make an inventory of all of the lichens that occur at a site. We identify any potential lichen that's an indicator of pollution, or we try to identify lichens that are indicators of healthy ecosystems. And then we also collect lichens that we grind up for elemental analysis to assess 25 different potential pollutants. And this has taken us all the way from desert communities in Arizona and New Mexico up to truly alpine communities in the Rocky Mountains, and everything in between to montane woodlands in the Great Basin. And we end up seeing this huge range of diversity with the aim of characterizing what is happening lichenologically across this area of the Intermountain West. And if you look here in the center column, these are just some examples of some of the beautiful lichens that we see. This is a big coral lichen that occurs on the soil. You find those things, you're really excited to see them. In other cases, the rocks are just painted with a million colors representing dozens and dozens of species, all on a rock the size of a basketball. Sometimes you have trees that are covered with lichens that are just glowing bright yellow. This is the iconic wolf lichen. Other rocks have these just moon-like colors coming off the rocks. In some cases, the trees are just dripping with lichens. And it's a fantastic job to get out, to be able to go out and explore the world and see things that no one ever sees. Sometimes as you're exploring this world, you're on the lookout for lichens that you know occur in an area and you never have seen them. This is one of my all-time favorites. This is the Arizona navel lichen. It's like the size of the palm of your hand. It's found nowhere else except on a few mountains in the Southern Rockies. And finding these things and holding them is like one of the best things you could ever experience. So as we do this program with over 500 sites, it's really a powerful thing to get out into the world and see the diversity. Think about that interrelatedness of everything. And as a professional lichenologist, sometimes it feels like I'm the only one that does this. And that is not true. There are a lot of incredible lichenologists that do something similar, but out there in the middle of nowhere, wandering around, it feels like, does anybody care? So one of the take-home points from this is that people do care. And the relationships with the people that care really matters. Here in the bottom left, this is an image of Linda Geiser. Linda Geiser works for the U.S. Forest Service, and her, along with Karen Dillman, they were the ones who really promoted the use of using lichens as biomonitors for the Forest Service. And her work has been transformative and pioneering in creating really cool opportunities for us to assess air quality in our wilderness areas. And I'm still working with Linda Geiser. She's close to retirement, and she sees the power and the value of this program. And she is doing everything she can to make sure that this continues on. And my life and my life is better because I know Linda and I know her passion for caring about the world around her. In the top right, the two folks on a horse, the guy with the red hat, his name is Mike DeVito. And Mike DeVito was a seasonal employee with the Forest Service. He taught at Pima Community College in Tucson, Arizona. And every summer he would come up and spend all of his time off working in the Uinta Mountains, often helping facilitate our research. And we'd be up there in the middle of nowhere, and Mike was the most cheerful, happy, optimistic person and could solve any problem. And my life is better because Mike cared enough to use his summers to go up and care for these beautiful resources. The last person I'm going to show on this slide is my advisor, Larry St. Clair. Larry was my PhD advisor, and I probably spent more time with Larry than I did with my wife for the 5 years that I was working on my PhD. and he cared about the world around him. And the relationships with these people almost supersede the excitement and the beauty of interacting with the world around us, with the lichens themselves. So people do care, and relationships with those people that care truly matter. I'm going to show you next a study from a friend of mine. This is a study by Pierluigi Nimis in Italy. And Pierluigi just celebrated his 70th birthday. And this is one of his most iconic studies that was published, I think, in 1996, where he was looking at lichen diversity and its relationship with health outcomes. So you can see we have two maps. The map on the left is the lichen biodiversity index, where the more green that map is, the higher the lichen diversity, and the more red that map is, the lower the lichen diversity. The map in the center is lung cancer mortality, with the brighter the red, the higher the lung cancer mortality, and the more green. He shouldn't have chose red and green. This was 1996, and he probably wasn't thinking about color blindness, but he chose some pretty bad colors. But otherwise, the story is really pretty cool. So if you look at those two maps and compare the lichen biodiversity index with lung cancer mortality, we see that there's a strong correlation between the two. And it's not that lichens are preventing lung cancer, right? This is just a correlation. But we see that, in fact, lichens can be a really good predictor of a lot of health outcomes. And this kind of work continues on. This is a study published, I think, 2 years ago. This is by Tanya Contardo in Italy as well, where she was looking at the impact of a municipal waste incinerator. And she found that, in fact, by transplanting lichens from unimpacted areas to areas close to this incinerator, she found this really cool pattern where air pollution has a higher impact on communities that are disadvantaged, right? So she's looking at that idea of social economical deprivation, and she's using lichens as a story to say people matter, relationships matter, and we can use lichens to help understand this. So now moving back to the US from Italy, I'm going to show you some of the work or the relationships that I have. This is a group of my students from earlier this year. Each one of these students knew nothing about lichens coming in, and now each one of the 5 has published their own, independent academic research. And despite the cool research that they do, the thing I value most are the relationships with these cool people that care about understanding the world about them. And it's not only the students that care. Here, this is from the Moab Festival of Science, where we have citizens that come out and they start to see the world in new ways, and they take hours out of their weekend to come out, climb around on their hands and knees and look at lichens on the sandstone. And they start to see the world in some completely new and novel ways. And what this does is it leads us to kind of do something like beyond science. Like, lichens are cool, understanding the impact of air pollution is really cool. But really what it leads to is it facilitates us asking questions in completely new and novel ways. We can only ask the questions that we have imagination for. So what does it take? What does it take to open our mind, change our perspective, and be able to ask new questions? And that is one of the most powerful things. And the best example of this was last year. I was able to go back and visit my very first research site. This research site was in central Utah on the Awapa Plateau. I think it was in 2004. I worked my guts out to understand the lichen diversity of this place. And just last year, I had the opportunity. I was driving past to do some other field work, and I decided to stop and sit down. And I was all alone, and I went out here and I started walking around, and I sat on a rock and I thought, what have I learned in the past 19 years? And I sat and I thought, and I sat and I thought, and I thought some more. And then I realized, I don't know if I know anything that I didn't know back then. The only thing I know now is how little I really know. And now I know that I have a mind full of a million questions that I would love to ask. And that's a really powerful thing to be able to develop that creativity to start asking questions and recognize how big and beautiful this world is, and that worshipfulness of thinking there's so much more to know. I don't know anything. And that happened here sitting in this lowly basalt field on the Awapa Plateau, where I realized again the nothingness of man. And it was a beautiful moment. So back to our biomonitoring program. This has been going on for 4 decades. I came into it about 16 years ago, and I visited nearly all of these sites. Each site is just loaded with all kinds of data, all kinds of information. And there's new ways of engaging with this information. And one of the ways is let's use some new tools. So then collaborating with some statisticians, we started taking these data and looking at them in new ways. I'm going to show you a series of 6 maps here. Here are those maps, and each one of those maps is looking at different chemical profiles from the lichens that we collected, trying to identify the source of the air pollution. And now using new tools, becoming more creative, we have this new insight, and we see that there are different factors, as we would hope, that lead to different patterns in air pollution. So for example, factor 1 in the top left, I don't know what factor 1 is. We don't know what it is, but it has a very specific chemical signal. But factor 1 is found largely in the Uinta Basin in northeastern Utah. We could drop down and look at factor 3. Again, I don't know exactly what factor 3 is. I know what its chemical profile looks like, but it has a much larger impact, a much larger impact in western Colorado. All right, so now using new tools and old data, we can start to get some really cool, novel perspectives. So what this looks like more from a bird's eye view is with our lichen air quality biomonitoring program. It spans over 40 years, and now we have over 500 air quality permanent reference sites. And some of those have burned, so they're not quite the same reference that they were. And this is one of the largest regional air quality biomonitoring programs in the entire world. From this program, we've collected more than 35,000 herbarium voucher specimens, and these are all housed at BYU's Life Science Museum, and they're deposited in our lichen herbarium, so those can be used for scientific study. We've documented 1,000 different species of lichens that occur in the Intermountain West, and we've described dozens of species new to science. We've collected, now it's probably almost 2,000 tissue samples that we can use for elemental analysis, looking at 20 different potential pollutants to try to tease out patterns and origin of air pollution across the Intermountain region. And the key to this whole program are the periodic reviews, coming back and every 5 to 7 years and making comparisons to the baseline that we have. And most of these reference sites have been evaluated at least once. So now as we're winding down, let's go back to where we started, back to Anaconda, Montana. This was that Superfund site that had been heavily impacted by nearly a century of mining. And now it's 300 square miles that has been designated as a Superfund site, and they have cleaned up huge amounts of it. The actual smelter was decommissioned in 1980, but all throughout these 300 square miles, there were high concentrations of arsenic and copper and zinc and cadmium, lead. And this was found in millions of cubic yards of tailings that were being blown all across the region. The soil was contaminated, groundwater was contaminated, streams were contaminated. And we came along and we did some biomonitoring. We have some reference sites in the Anaconda-Pintler Wilderness area. And we found, and this is just a map of those reference sites in the Anaconda-Pintler, this yellow star represents the copper smelter. And we found that the sites in the western part of the wilderness area were healthy. They were in good shape. No damage from air pollution, no elevated levels of pollutants. But as we got closer to the copper smelter, we had higher and higher levels of some of these pollutants. And here in the graph, we're looking at the levels of lead, nickel, arsenic, and copper. And it was first sampled in 1992. I was 12 years old then, so I wasn't a part of this. I don't even know if I knew what lichens were when I was 12. But we came back in 2004. This is one of my first sites that I visited, and then in 2008. And we can see that over the course of what is that, 15 or 16 years or so, we've had steady decreases in the concentration of these potential pollutants. We've also had increasing lichen diversity in those sites, where some of these big fruticose, beautiful lichens are now starting to return to the site that had been damaged from the late 1880s all the way until 1980. So we have a decrease in potential pollutants and an increasing number in sensitive indicator lichens, and we're seeing the evidence of a powerful recovery. And then finally, going back to this work in Donora, Pennsylvania, where we had individuals that cared enough to assess the situation and find solutions to help and care for people. And my hope is that our lichen biomonitoring program is a way to identify areas in wilderness areas, natural areas that are in peril, and propose solutions or ways to come to the rescue and protect these beautiful communities that are part of the creation on Earth. And the dream would be, let's use indicators of bad air quality in our wilderness areas to come up with workable solutions that we can come through and save these incredible, iconic sites. That's a part of what we do at BYU, and this is what I love to see: healthy air quality, healthy lichen communities, and a place where future generations can enjoy this incredible creation. Happy to take any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Steve. That was so fascinating. Like, the world is such a strange and wonderful place.
Ain't it the truth?